Afternoon, everybody. My name is Kim Speckhahn, and I am a International Board Certified Lactation Consultant. I'm employed with North County Health Services, WIC, up in the North County. So for those of you who are North County partners, that's where I come from. And most of my work is focused up there with my position within WIC. I've been working with lactation accommodations in varying degrees through my partnership with Shana, and I can't even remember how I came into the COI, to tell you the truth. It was kind of a convoluted thing, but it was several years ago, and I've had the pleasure and the privilege to work with lactation supportive environments in kind of getting out of the clinic with one-on-one breastfeeding support, and really sort of opening my eyes to things that I didn't think about when I became a lactation consultant. I just wanted to help moms and babies, but I didn't really think about all of the systemic and all of the policy and all the environmental changes that need to be put into place to actually support the moms that I'm working with in the clinic. So it's been really, really neat, and I've actually found that I've sort of been drawn more to this type of work. Not that I still don't like working with moms and babies, and I could talk about that all day. But what I'd like to do is start off, because we're going to be talking about what's in a wellness policy as far as lactation accommodations, and kind of do a little bit of background, because when I think of this, the lactation accommodations are actually in all of the domains. I love that each domain has that piece in it, because it's really an upstream approach. It's starting at the very first place where we can actually set up the mother, the baby, for the best outcomes when it comes to health. And when we're looking at what the COI does, we're looking at obesity prevention. So as you can see, breastfeeding is not just something that happens between the mom and the baby, but it's a cultural event, and it's something that cultures do and not just moms do. So I used to think, oh yeah, if you wanted to breastfeed, it was just a motivation thing, a thing that a mom did. And I've learned that that's not true, and I think many of you could say the same. How many of you have been mothers and have gone back to work, just within the room here? Okay, so a good percentage of you. And then I see that we have a large childbearing population here today. So some of this information, maybe you haven't gone down that parenting road yet, or that breastfeeding road, and this will be really interesting for you. But the take home is that breastfeeding it's what cultures do. And so when we're looking at the schools and the after school domains, we're really looking at a specific part of the puzzle, a specific stakeholdership, if you will, for how to support breastfeeding. And it just so happens that August, I think Deidre might have planned it this way, is National Breastfeeding Month. And the first week in August is always World Breastfeeding Week. And some of you might have heard of some celebrations going around, the big Latch-On event that happens on the first Friday or Saturday of the first week of August. And then this week actually is Black Breastfeeding Week. So it's the perfect time to highlight lactation accommodations. So let's go ahead and take a look about lactation accommodations, and how does that fit into all of the childhood obesity initiatives. And like I mentioned before, it's an upstream approach, because we are looking at the first food and the first physical activity when we're talking about a baby at birth. So you can't start any what's the word? That's the origin, right? It's much easier if we can set up the system so that the baby's biology and the architecture of every body system is set into that perfect place where the biological norm is pretty perfect, the way feeding works, then we don't have to do any fixing. We don't have to do as many interventions. So it's really beautiful that lactation and breastfeeding support is in this domain. So let's take a look at some of the benefits of lactation accommodation for babies. So we're going to kind of go and just review and sort of think to ourselves, well, what is the big deal about breastfeeding? Isn't it just a way to feed a baby? So I bet many of you have some ideas about what some of the benefits of breastfeeding are, and I think we could probably say, well, let's hear it. Put some out there if you could. Immunization, yeah, breast milk is actually the baby's immune system. Babies do not have their own active immune system, so all of their immunities come through the passive immunities of breast milk. So that's why you hear sometimes that breastfed babies tend to get sick less often. Or if they do get sick, and they do, it's usually not as intense or it doesn't last quite as long. So yeah, absolutely. Well, here we are in the COI. What is the connection or that you might have heard between breastfeeding and childhood obesity? Think it's more? Think it's less? Think it's about the same? Studies have shown that childhood obesity rates tend to be less for babies who are breastfed, and it really looks at exclusivity and duration of breastfeeding. So any amount of breastfeeding is good, but we're going to really see those connections between decreased risk for childhood obesity when the biological normal way to breastfeed, the way babies are expecting, the way their bodies are designed, the way mothers' bodies are designed, when babies are breastfed for 6 months exclusively, and this can happen when breastfeeding is going well, then that is setting up every body system in the baby's body for optimal development, not super development, but just normal development. So we often talk about breast milk as the superfood, and indeed it is, but really it's just the normal food that human mammalian babies are meant to grow on. So we have a lot of, you could keep punching them through there. So there is this dose dependent of that. The first bullet point that I spoke about is that the longer and more exclusive a baby is breastfed, and the norm is 6 months before we usually introduce complementary foods. But the longer in duration, meaning a year, 2 years, 3 or more, the more breast milk a baby gets, the more benefits that baby accrues. And so you can see on the right, the other benefits to babies are some of the things that we talked about with decreased risks of illness. And there are several bullet points there that refer to sibling studies and also to the relationship to lower BMI in adults for babies and children who were breastfed. So we have the Surgeon General's call to action, 2020 Healthy People goals. We have a lot of policy calls that are promoting this because it's best practice. And the reason, let me kind of go back into a little bit more of sort of the science behind it without really going into the science. The way breastfeeding works is that the baby is in control. And the baby is determining how much milk the baby needs and so how long the baby breastfeeds. It's completely opposite to bottle feeding, whether we're feeding breast milk or we're feeding formula or anything else. When we are bottle feeding, the adult or whoever's feeding is taking that locus of control. Now, the way our physiology is designed is that the baby was born to have that self-regulatory mechanism, have the architecture set down, and have it preserved. And so when a baby's at the breast, lots of components in the breast milk and lots of hormones are signaling to the baby when, say, the little baby's done with the breastfeed, you're done. You've had adequate amount of what we would call the sort of the fore milk, or if you want to call it fore milk, it tends to be the more watery milk. And as the baby drains the breast, the milk in the more deeper parts of the ducts that is being made as the baby drains the breast haven't had time to collect as much water from sitting in the breast. So that milk tends to be more fatty. So the hormones and the fatty content actually send a signal to the baby's brain, you're good, you're full. And that's when we see our babies slowing down at the breast or falling asleep at the breast. So it's this self-regulation that is absolutely crucial, and this is what scientists think is what actually sets the baby up for less risk of becoming obese. Babies are learning to self-regulate, they're learning to eat when they're hungry and stop when they're full, just based on physiological signals. Imagine that. We know when we get older, there's a lot more that comes into the whole, the whole play of eating. And it's very easy to overfeed a baby with a bottle unless you're really clued in to looking at those babies' cues, so that when babies are showing satiety cues or fullness cues, we're not trying to get that little last bit of whatever's in the bottle into the baby, because that overrides that self-regulation. Does that make sense? So that's kind of the underlying rationale for how breastfeeding and this self-regulation actually correlates with the decreased risks of being overweight. Okay, so I'm going to cut here. Let's take a look at moms. If you want to go ahead and you can flip through and get everything up there. So breastfeeding is equally beneficial for moms. I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but it completes the end of the childbearing year. So all mothers will lactate if they have glandular tissue, whether they choose to breastfeed or not. And there are benefits to breastfeeding. We know breastfeeding stops the uterus, clamps the uterus, so it stops bleeding at birth. There's a decreased risk of postpartum depression from the oxytocin levels. We have a lot less risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes type 2, and osteoporosis. So when a school district or a culture or anybody is implementing policies and systems changes to support breastfeeding, it really speaks volumes for how they value the mother-child relationship in their culture. Next slide. So we can imagine if we have healthier moms, we're going to see a savings in costs for health care. And we also see those in a savings for employers. And we see savings all over the place. But the theory, or the latest statistics show that we could save $13 billion yearly if, say, 90% of the families could breastfeed their babies exclusively for 6 months. So that would be mostly in healthcare costs. The chart there shows beautifully, over 2,000 less physician visits, less prescriptions, mostly for ear infections, and days in the hospital. So breast milk is especially important for our preemie babies and our sick babies. Days, we've all heard of that. So from preconception through the second year of the baby's life, breast milk does incredible things, and breastfeeding does incredible things for both the mom and for the baby. So nutritional status is what breast milk was what it does the best. So we can see that there's a huge impact with good nutrition early in life for babies. Now, these kiddos grow up, right? And that's where you, as a domain, tend to have more of an effect. But our babies today are going to be the students that we're dealing with now that might end up having some of those higher risks of obesity. So the more we can lower that, the less work we have to do, and the more work we can focus on, or we can focus our efforts more. So let's take a look at school districts and the employees of school districts, who could be support staff, teachers, everybody involved. School districts, if we look around the room, here's the school domain, it's primarily women. So many of our employees, in fact, 73% of teachers in California are women. So it's very estrogen rich, wouldn't you say? And the other thing about schools is that, we have our schedules. So the scheduling can cause some rigidity and difficulty in meeting those lactation accommodations for our teachers. And so it's a very important place to start off first with our employees, so that we're actually modeling and walking the walk, so that this becomes more of just a system-wide experience. So if we look at the next slide, how lactation accommodation benefits school districts, well, imagine those of you who have gone back to work as breastfeeding moms. What are some of the things that maybe you could chime in that are a benefit? If you're having a baby, if your baby's breastfed and is in childcare, usually those babies end up missing less childcare. They get sick less, which means that mom isn't having to take work off or call in and get a substitute teacher because of childhood sickness. So there's a decreased absenteeism, which is good for everybody. It's good for the kids in the class, or if she's a teacher, or it's going to save costs in healthcare also. And think about it from a retention point of view. Many teachers, how many of you have known friends who haven't come back to work because the difficulty, there's a lot of challenges. It's a huge logistic production to figure out childcare, to figure out lactation accommodations, to find a place, etc. So it's a very wise decision for school districts to have lactation accommodation policies for their employees. And it's because some of our school districts are going to be are going to be having their pupils are of childbearing age, and teen pregnancy has always happened and will always continue to happen. And it's a right of students who are in school and who have children and who want to breastfeed to be able to have that right to parent as well as complete their education and have lactation accommodations. So this is more of a new policy that we're going to talk about. But if we're not supporting our teen moms, then we're basically just creating the cycle of lack of access to breastfeeding support, and we're increasing our odds of having more childhood obesity later on. But administrators at school districts often value the lactation accommodations for employees, but then kind of like, well, for students, hadn't really thought of that. So that is at least something that's equally important, lactation accommodations for both staff and students. So I work a lot with the teen parent programs up in North County, and we support them with one of the legislative bills that you're going to be seeing in just a minute. But it's a win-win for everybody, because when students have lactation accommodations, you're taking, well, anyone who's had a baby. It's a sacred, vulnerable time of your life, and especially for a teen. So it could go two ways. It could look really good, or it could just kind of go downhill for a lot of them. And our public health nurses, our teen programs do incredible work in supporting those moms. And we're going to find that it meets everybody's goals. Students are able to become parents and feed their children in a way that they want to, and then they're also able to graduate. And so it ends up saving everybody a lot of money, and it helps everybody get where they need to be. So there are lots of resources that are coming out now, which Shana's going to go over on our resource sheet for parenting students. So really quick, at lactation accommodation laws. How am I doing on that? So there are a host of laws, federal and state, that protect working moms and working students. And AB Assembly Bill 1025 is probably one of the most widely known that most school districts and employers are aware of. And this requires that every employer in the state provide reasonable lactation accommodations, which means a reasonable amount of break time. And it means also a place to express milk or to breastfeed other than a bathroom. Because if you think about it, that's really not an appropriate place to be feeding a child. Now, have we done it, and will we still continue to do it if we need to? Absolutely. We'll do whatever we need to for those of us who want to breastfeed. But we're setting some standards here so that it should be an appropriate space. And I'm not going to go into detail over the law, but the idea is that we're trying to remove barriers, and it has to start with legislation, policy, systematic changes, environmental changes. So these lactation accommodation policies are super critical. And so we also have lactation accommodation policies for students, and the newest one that came out was in 2016, which is Assembly Bill 302. And this is more of what my work's been focused on up in the North County region, is schools are required to provide the same lactation accommodations for students. So we can't discriminate based on parenting status or breastfeeding status or pregnancy status of our students. And so, you know, this is new. It's kind of challenging for some school districts to think, okay, well, we got the employee thing down, but the student thing kind of varies. However, it's the law. So one of the things that well, what this requires is the same thing as it does for employees, is reasonable break time, a private, safe place to pump and to store milk or to breastfeed. And of course, our teen parent programs just overlap beautifully and provide all this on-site service. But schools that a student has the right to breastfeed or pump at any school that doesn't host on its campus a teen parent program. So the way we've kind of addressed this up in North County is one of my roles is working as a regional breastfeeding liaison, which is sort of the WIC program's outreach arm for identifying gaps in breastfeeding support. So one unique way that we've sort of figured out how to partner with schools and public health nurses and teen parent programs is to, first of all, help educate the schools on AB 302, and so that they can take a look at what are their lactation accommodation policies for students, and then remove some of those barriers. So our local WIC agencies have partnered with Escondido Union High School District, Ramona Union School District, our Unified, San Marcos, and Vista, and we work with the teen parent coordinators. In some cases, in Ramona, it's our public health nurse, and we plant pumps on site so that those students who most likely are WIC participants don't need to haul their pump to school. If they're pumping, they can keep their WIC pump at home, but we plant the same type of pump on campus so that it's one less barrier for this student. And then we also, if we need to, help them figure out, well, what does lactation accommodation look like? A student can't be penalized for taking time off to breastfeed academically or to pump. So it's just a really nice way to remove these barriers for our students. I've talked a lot. Any questions so far?
Yes.
Yes.
In the East region, a lot of our teen moms have started to go to charter high schools.
Mm-hmm.
I know charter schools don't have to conform to some lunch policy rules.
They are required.
Do they have to conform to lactation accommodation?
They do. Yes. Yep. Good question. So they still fall under the provisions of AB 302. Yeah. And then
when he says reasonable amount of time,
mm-hmm.
it's not open for discussion. What does that mean?
So that's a very good point. It is. Now, the whole idea, and when you talk to some of the teen parent programs, there are some students who will try to use this to weasel out of class. Not my words, their words. And so when we can get one of our hospital grade double electric pumps, one of our teen parents sold it to the school board. This pump just sucks the life out of them and gets them back into class fast. But from a breastfeeding management, let me answer that question a little bit more with a little bit more evidence. Pumping is a learned art. It's a skill that takes time, and it's different for every woman, and it's not one pump fits one size for all. But for a mother who is skilled at pumping, she can usually drain her breast within 10 to 15 minutes. Need about 5 minutes to store, write down when she pumped her milk, put it into the refrigerator, clean her pump kit, and then get back to class. So we're talking basically a minimum of 20 minutes for most. Now, and that depends on where the accommodations are. If she's got to walk from one part of campus across the football field to the teen parent program, then of course that's going to change the time. So it's also working with school districts to try to put these lactation accommodations in places that are going to keep the moms in class and and minimize the time that they're out of class. So it's a very nebulous amount of time. But it would not be reasonable to say, I need 45 minutes. So 20 minutes to a half an hour. Yeah, good question. Anybody else?
When did AB 302 go into effect?
That was January 1st, 2016. Yeah, and many schools aren't informed about this. So since I'm up mostly in the North County, I focus on the school districts in my geographical region. This is really on schools to do themselves. However, we have regional breastfeeding liaisons, and in San Diego Central, we have Kim Elkins at American Red Cross. So she would be a contact for someone who could provide information, or I would be happy to be a contact. I work with Kim closely, and that's just one avenue to provide school districts the support. But most teen parent programs, Title IX, it's part of their job to be compliant with everything. So the Title IX coordinator would be the person to find out, what are we doing for lactation accommodations for AB 302. Okay, so I hope I've given you a little bit of the background of why. Now Shana is our lactation supportive environment specialist, so she's going to go into more detail about what's in a lactation accommodation policy.
Thanks, Kim. And again, my name is Shana Wright Bruno. I work with UC San Diego Center for Community Health. I oversee the Lactation Supportive Environments projects. And previously, through the County of San Diego Health and Human Services Agency, with funding from First Five and many years ago with funding from the CDC, we've worked with school districts to help them implement policies, specifically policies to support employee lactation accommodation. Currently, we are working with child care providers providers to help them become breastfeeding friendly, but I'm happy to share, some of our experiences in working to get policies adopted and what some of our best practices are. So you can see on the screen, this for all of our projects has been our lactation support model for success. You need all components to have a successful program. If you have a policy but it's not communicated, no one will know. If you have a lactation room, but there's no policy to support it or it's not communicated, no one knows. And if you don't provide education to your principals, your teachers, to your staff, they won't know how to accommodate employees, and employees won't know that they can be accommodated. So we really need all of these things: policy, environmental changes, systems changes as far as communication, and then education and resources to make a comprehensive lactation accommodation program. So I want to talk a little bit about policy adoption, and we've had a lot of people say, well, do I really need a policy? It's the law, we just do it. And so I want to talk a little bit about why a policy is important. Policies are sustainable. So you may have someone currently at the school district who's really pro-breastfeeding, very supportive, but what happens when that person leaves or they retire or they move on? It provides a directive. So people know how to support lactation accommodation. Employees know how they'll be supported when they come back. And it really lays everything out nicely so people don't have to guess what they need to do and what they will have done for them. And then communication. If it's in writing, it's easier to communicate. It's easier to send out and say, hey, we support breastfeeding, and here's how we do it. And, Kim mentioned that there is a law, there's both federal and state law to support lactation accommodation in workplaces, and the policy really shows that you're in compliance with that law. So I want to talk about a couple sample policies, because I know policies with school districts can be tricky, and sometimes the word policy, people just shut down and they stop listening. But the good thing is that the California School Boards Association has sample policy to support lactation accommodation at school districts. This sample policy is BP 4033, and there's many school districts in San Diego County that have adopted this policy. And CSBA actually granted permission to anybody who, not only their members, but any school district in the state of California, to use this policy. So your school districts can use this policy as is, or they're welcome to modify it to meet their needs. And that usually makes the policy adoption a little bit easier because it's already been vetted by California School Boards Association. And this was a really big collective impact win in our first lactation supportive environments project. Worked with the California School Boards Association, UCSD, San Diego County Office of Ed to get them to write this sample policy and agree to open it up to any school district in California. And then in response to AB 302, California School Boards Association wrote an sample language that can be added to BP 5146, which is the married, pregnant, and parenting student policy. And so they have agreed to share the excerpt that specifically focuses on lactation accommodation for students. So again, many school districts may already have a married, pregnant, and parenting policy, which is generally BP 5146, but they can amend this policy or update it to add in support for lactation accommodation. And those are actually included in the handout that you have on your desk, and I'm sure it'll be available for download as well, so you can see what those are. So I also mentioned you need systems changes. How do your employees or students know that they'll be accommodated? We know that going back to work after having a baby, there's many challenges. And oftentimes if moms don't feel that they'll be supported at work, or they don't know that they'll be supported to continue breastfeeding and pumping milk for their baby, they may think, I have to go back to work. I can't continue to breastfeed, and they may stop sooner than they're ready to stop breastfeeding. So It's really important that it's communicated to employees the support for lactation accommodation and any policies that are part of the school district. And these are just some examples of how it can be communicated. There's lots of different ways, but we've seen school districts during the hiring process. Again, that kind of goes back to what Kim mentioned as far as loyalty and retention. If upfront employees know that they'll be supported if they want to start a family, they may decide to stay with the school district longer. When employees are going out on maternity leave, so that when they're making that decision whether or not to breastfeed, they have that information before they return from leave. It's great to do principal training so that principals at the schools know that this is part of our school culture and this is what we do. Placing the language in the employee handbook. Some school districts have done a resolution, and then also placing language in the wellness policy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's really great, especially if you have a policy, to put language in your wellness policy under staff wellness, and then relay it to the actual board policy that your district has. And then for students, communication is equally as important. We want to let students know that the district supports lactation accommodation before they go out on leave. When they're re-enrolling in school, let them know that if they are breastfeeding and would like to continue, they'll be supported to pump at school. If the district has a student-parent handbook, and again in the wellness policy as well. And Kim talked a little bit about environmental what the environment needs. You know, there needs to be a place that's private, that's not a restroom for employees and students to pump. And so that's something else that school districts will want to think about. Well, where do employees pump and or where do students pump, and what is that? So there are probably very few school districts that have a designated lactation mother's room. You can see the example on your left. Shows a before and after picture, and this was one of the schools that we worked with in our first project, and they actually had parents and teachers kind of get together. They found a room and they painted it and had donations put in there. So you don't need to have a fancy, expensive lactation room. You just need a place that's private, preferably a door that locks. It's not really fun to be walked in on while you're pumping. It's not quite as cute as breastfeeding, and it's not. And that can also be a temporary space. So it doesn't have to be, and I know this is one thing that school districts are like, we have no extra space to designate a lactation room. Are you kidding me? Like, we are on, like, having 2 classrooms in 1 classroom and all of these things. So I totally understand. I get it. Space is very precious at school districts. So a temporary space. So identifying, you know, if we have an employee who needs to pump, if we have a student who needs to pump, where can they do that? Is that an office somewhere that, you know, whoever's office that is would agree to take a break so they can pump in there? And, you know, the temporary space, the picture up here, actually, my former colleague, her daughter-in-law was a science teacher, and this is where she was pumping. It's not beautiful, but it works. There's a chair, a table, and an outlet, and a little skeleton in the back closet there. But as Kim mentioned, you know, if moms will make it work, and so just finding something that is a clean space, that there are no hazardous chemicals, a closet can work too as well. But
I bet some teachers have pumped in a janitor's
yeah,
room.
yeah, and that I would say would be facilities, when you're looking for space, is your best friend, because they know every nook and cranny. And so really getting in with your facilities staff to say, hey, you know, where would this space be? What would that look like? And you know, if you can make it a little bit nicer, doing that too. And then it's nice to have breastfeeding friendly signage too. We have these door hangers that you see up here, so if anybody needs these, I'm more than happy to give them to you. But it's nice, especially if the door doesn't lock, to put that on the door, and that way people know, okay, someone's in here, shouldn't come in. Doesn't always work, but it's a nice touch. And then we talked about education and resources. So what else do we need to know? So trainings, and I know usually when the school year starts, there are meetings, there are trainings. You don't have to spend a lot of time on lactation accommodation, but just making sure that superintendents, principals, teachers are aware of this policy when the school year starts. You may have new superintendents, new principals, new teachers, but just making sure that they know that this is part of the school culture that you work at. It's also great, your superintendents of HR, to make sure that they're aware of this, and then sometimes they can actually go out and provide the training to the principals. And then the last piece is resources, and all of these resources are actually on our website and the San Diego County Breastfeeding Coalition website, but we have resources for HR, so an HR folder, principal folders, a maternity leave packet, and an employee binder that just kind of talks about how to support employees, how employees will be supported, and really what does it look like when you're getting ready to come back from work, from maternity leave, and what pumping and working kind of looks like. It doesn't really look like what you think it's going to look like. So as Kim mentioned before, breastfeeding creates healthier generations. Our babies today are our students tomorrow, and if we look down the road, they're our future workforce as well. So if your district doesn't have a policy, there's sample policy there, and we're going to talk a little bit about wellness policy, because I know this will be relevant for many of you who are on wellness committees or who attend wellness committee meetings. So lactation accommodation and wellness policies, can anybody tell me why policies are important? They're up there. It's okay. This was a little test. Again, it demonstrates compliance with the law. It's sustainable. If your breastfeeding champion leaves, the policy stays. It provides a directive so both employees and employers know what and how to accommodate. And it is a really clear way to communicate the district's support for breastfeeding. And so we talked a little bit about the board policies, but what about language and wellness policies? And so I mentioned that this really reinforces your board policy. And it really is a natural fit in the wellness policy because of breastfeeding's link to health and wellness of mothers, of babies, and of future students. So it just fits, in there. I know it's not a requirement of wellness policies, but it really is a natural fit. And then I did want to just show a list of, and this list was last updated fall of 2015, so there may be more school districts, because that's been about 3 years since we did the scan, but these are the school districts with lactation accommodation policies that we had as of 2015. So we had about 30 of the 42 school districts that said they had lactation accommodation policies. Many of them are BP 4033. Some have just crafted their own policy. Some of the smaller districts crafted their own policy. And so when we did this scan, 37 out of the 42 school districts we were able to reach. There are a handful that we don't know that were supposed to get back to us, but unfortunately, they haven't. And then I don't know how many have policies for students. That's not something that we've looked at and not something that we have done yet. So that might be something interesting. Maybe, Deirdre, do you know?
Yeah, when we did our recent scan of all the policies to look for certain components, lactation accommodation was one of them, and we found 4 districts and 1 in draft still that definitely have language on lactation accommodation. But I think it's just 1 unless any Unify has students included.
We don't have students. I actually made them.
Okay, so Sweetwater then. And that's actually the sample policy. What was this saying? The sample policy here for, this is for staff, but there are students mentioned in Sweetwater's policy. And that's the only one that I know of that mentions students, because that was just updated, I think, last year.
Okay.
So Chula Vista Elementary School District, San Diego Unified, San Ysidro, Sweetwater, definitely have lactation in their policies.
They have the BP 5146.
Not the whole thing, but
Okay.
they mention of it, they would get back to their full policy or just mention that they do comply with the laws and they support it.
Okay.
And Lemon Grove has that in their draft policy that hasn't been.
Perfect.
So that's only 5, and the 4 North County districts that Kim mentioned, they don't have it in their wellness policy, so that's an opportunity. They have an MOU and they're supportive, and then all these So, you know, we would like all of the districts to have it in their wellness policy too.
Yes, we would. Okay, so it sounds like a handful of schools actually have a policy for students that's referenced in their wellness policy. Oh, one. Okay, and the others just reference it in their wellness policy, but there's not a formal board policy.
Well, the student is referenced in the wellness policy.
Right.
I don't know if they have a full policy.
A full board policy.
Or
Yeah.
student services.
Yeah.
I just know 5 districts that have it mentioned in their policy, one of which also includes students.
Great. Great.
What does the asterisk mean by all references?
Yeah, so the asterisks actually, these are school districts that have been winners of the San Diego County Breastfeeding Coalition Breastfeeding Friendly Workplace Award. So these school districts have been winners in the previous year for the work that they've done to support, again, support the work around lactation accommodation for employees. So that's mainly what our work has focused on. So as Deirdre mentioned, the school district wellness policy, staff wellness, lactation accommodation policy, these school districts have language already in there, but maybe not San Diego Unified? It is? Okay.
Yeah, we have it, we just don't have the student.
You don't have the student accommodation. Okay, great. Yeah. So again, districts reps have a lot of influence and can advocate for lactation accommodation to be placed in the school district wellness policies under staff wellness. And so you can also boast how this not only affects staff, but future generations of students that are coming in. If we think back to all those benefits to breastfeeding that Kim mentioned for not only mothers, but babies as well.
Working with an elementary school district, there may be less justification for getting the students included in there, but if it's, you know, even up through middle school, you know, then they probably should include that.
Yeah, I agree. And then lastly, I just wanted to discuss the resource sheet that you have on your table in front of you. If you look under the first bar, these are some of the resources that are available to districts to support lactation accommodation. I mentioned the San Diego County Breastfeeding Coalition, their website. They actually have information for employers and employees on breastfeeding laws and steps to providing accommodation. There's also sample policy that's located there. UCSD Center for Community Health. Previously, we provided technical assistance and support for schools and districts. And if you need help, just call me or email me. I'm happy to provide information or chat with you to work through any challenges that you may be addressing. But our website also has some of those resources. There's scheduling solutions for teachers and staff. If you think about especially elementary school teachers, their schedules are so highly inflexible. They're with their kids all day long. So it really does take some planning and some commitment and support from administration to figure out when they're going to be able to pump, who's going to cover their class, and what that looks like for especially elementary school teachers, but all teachers and staff. And then the business case for breastfeeding toolkit really is walks you through everything that you would need to know. It's really great, especially for HR, so that they know exactly what they need to do to put into place policies and how to support employees. And it also answers a lot of those questions that might come up that you're like, I'm not sure what to do here. It'll give you scenarios and things like that as well. And then the wellness committees. This is kind of a call to action for wellness committees. Become familiar with these resources on here. Review the model policy language, and the model policy language is on this sheet as well, both the model policy for employees, which is BP 4033, and the model policy language for students, which is the addition to BP 5146. And then really be a voice in the community and encourage, and or if you already have, strengthen lactation accommodation language for students and employees. And if you already have this language, you know, ask how is this being implemented, and what else can we do? So that's our ask for National Breastfeeding Awareness Month. Our contact information is up here on the slide. You're welcome to contact both me or Kim with any questions you may have or any support that you may need. We're happy to help. Thanks. Yay. Yeah, she knows everything.
Question, just a comment. I think there were two wellness committee series of meetings I sat on that were modifying their policies, and both of them just mentioning, oh, do you have anything on lactation? They didn't, and they were like, oh yeah, we need to do that. So, and especially one already had accommodations. I think maybe both of them. One of them looked into it, and the other one's like, oh, we already have accommodations. And I'm like, well, then put it in there so it just shows what you're doing. So they've been, most school districts are very receptive, they just never thought of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when you explain, it's really just a couple of sentences showing support and then linking back to like the HR policy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's usually the easy ask. You just have to bring it up.
Just have to ask, yeah.
I wanted to ask, how, I'm trying to figure out how to say this. Is there a way for a school district to have advocacy efforts from the San Diego County Breastfeeding Coalition to the school district? And I'm asking that because when I was working on the award application for our lactation room, one of the questions, which was great that there were these questions, was about what training and information we're providing to staff. So because of the application, I contacted HR, I said, and benefits, and I said, what are we telling the staff about lactation accommodation? And the answer really was that we aren't educating them in any way. So when Shana was going through all of the different ways, the kinds of communication you can provide, we're not doing any of it yet. And as much as I want to think that me as one individual can change what an institution is doing, I know that I have found that not to be the case. So, is there a way for the Breastfeeding Coalition to work with the district to meet with HR or benefits or one of the organizations within the coalition to kind of create the meeting? Because I'm not going to get the meeting, I can guarantee you. But if the outside partner requests the meeting, then we may have the meeting. Does that make sense?
So first of all, don't underestimate yourself, because the changes that we see happen with one person like yourself who's like, well, I'm not getting the attention, but you just keep at it. This is how we saw the MOU come into play. We had offered it to the table at our NFP CAB meetings up in North County, where all the teen programs were at, and it took one person in our Escondido Union School District to Union High School District to get it going, and she was the squeaky wheel. And she made the point that, it just takes one student or the employees, they were fine, but it takes one student who we don't provide this to create it could be a really not a good situation. As far as the coalition, we're an all volunteer board and we haven't developed anything other than to share the language. We would accompany you on a volunteer basis to get the attention. I think you have to learn the language that's going to reach the decision makers. And let me tell you, you would think that this is all happening in healthcare, that HR and community health centers were routinely communicating their lactation accommodation policies to their employees. This is something that just often goes under the radar. They have the language in their policy, but the systems changes aren't there. So it's like Shana said, you can have the policy, but if it's not routinely communicated, it doesn't really matter, but it's where you have to start. So I would, let's keep talking. We'll see what we can come up with. The coalition is working with, we're supporting the childcare trainings that we're doing. We've had a request from the library system because we had a patron who was a volunteer in the library system, didn't quite know that it's okay to nurse in public. And so the library system is saying, help us, we need to routinely communicate this to our employees and volunteers, that this is the law and that there's a way to tactfully deal with patrons to respectfully, let them breastfeed. But, it's just, it seems like a no-brainer, but there's a lot of work to be done. So I would encourage you to keep it on the radar.
Well, anyone in the room knows that I am speaking
Yeah,
but I'm also smart enough to know that our partners can move things forward much faster
Yeah.
than we sometimes can. And I've learned that from being a partner on
part of her work time is working on this regional breastfeeding liaison grant. So she identifies gaps in breastfeeding support in her area, her geographic area. So she would be someone, she's also on the board too. So we're all kind of interconnected. But yeah, she would be a resource for you as well. But I'll tell you, breastfeeding is one of those polarizing subjects. And it's also a very emotional subject, because if you think of breastfeeding, it's a very right brain activity. It's the emotional, intuitive activity. If you can find someone on your school board or in your executive leadership team who has breastfed, or a man who has a partner, or anyone who has a partner who has breastfed, if you can reach them on a personal level, you can find who your breastfeeding champions are. And once you identify your breastfeeding champions, that's when changes really start happening. So just another.
So this is an example of, I'm not allowed to contact our board members. So this is the kind of thing where I would say, again, our partners can contact our board members.
Okay.
Not contact our board.
So yeah, so the coalition could easily write a letter of advocacy on your behalf. Yeah, to say it's come to our attention that, however we want to word it.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, and hopefully one of our seminars coming up in the future is going to be breastfeeding in the law, and we're really hoping to focus this for HR departments, so that they're aware of what the laws are, and then schools are, like we said, there's that area where, it's, like you said, it's like, oh yeah, we're already doing that, but it looks different everywhere, whether the policy is actually implemented, all that. So I love this because it brings up just the culture of breastfeeding and how it's a cultural thing, and everyone has a piece of the pie in supporting moms because they can't do it by themselves, and we know that it's the best for our babies who are going to grow up and be healthy and keep doing this. But we have to see it more.
One point you had made about, I think both of you made, that one reason to get this information into policy, specifically wellness policy, has to do with communication. And I think that HR policies are not something that students ever see. HR policies aren't things that parents see, or most staff don't necessarily read HR policy. But a lot of districts are doing a better job about really getting their wellness policy better communicated to staff and students and parents. And so if there's a mention of lactation accommodation and wellness policy, that can also raise the visibility of it even more than in the HR policy. So if you're ever, if you're a district rep or you're working with district staff and you wonder, well, how am I supposed to remember all these different things that I'm supposed to advocate for to get in wellness policy or to get implemented, you look on the back of your agenda, you see our advocacy menu of options, and the first 6 are more overarching. They have to do with, just generally have an active wellness council, just generally work to strengthen your wellness policy. But if you look at 7 through 20, those are specific topics that, keeping those 14 things in mind at all times, and you'll see that number 14 is lactation accommodation for staff and students. So it's kind of like where you see an opening. If they're revising their policy, we want to try to get all of this in there, and there's sample language for all of it. But if you're just hearing that, suddenly there's an interest in, oh, did you hear about that new law for student lactation accommodation? You can kind of squeeze in and say, yeah, I've got all kinds of resources about that. That's one of the 14 things I'm supposed to be advocating for. So that's the point of having people come in and give you a lot more background and information and have these resources readily available. This What's in a Wellness Policy resource sheet, along with I think 18 others, are on the however many there are. Was it 13? I think it came up with 13 altogether, are on the COI website, so you can always access them that way. So thank you so much for
Thank
presenting
you.
to us.
Yeah, thank you.